Next, a dashing hero, a dangerous encounter, and a dramatic conclusion. Find out about the leading role played by Fort Lee in the early days of film, and see one of the few places that remains from that glamorous era.
I'm looking over the edge here. I mean, I think, we might all do a few things in the name of fame, but Ken, would you go over the edge there?
No, I would let you do it though. Also, the lost botanical treasures of Madison. We uncover rare details about a once thriving industry that later vanished. All that and more on Drive-By History. Made possible by the generous support of King's Food Markets, one of the local top 100 employers listed in New Jersey Business Magazine. King's, where inspiration strikes. Founded in 1936 in Summit, New Jersey, King's has been a familiar and trusted friend to area families for almost 80 years. Through its Act Against Hunger initiative, King's is making an impact on hunger relief throughout the communities it serves, with over 100,000 pounds of food donated each year and countless monetary donations made to those in need. King's is proud to be part of New Jersey's history. Additional funding provided by Barnabas Health, serving more than 2 million patients throughout the state, including St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, Newark Beth Israel Medical Center in Newark, and Clara Moss Medical Center in Belleville. Hey Sin, did you ever pass by one of those history marker signs and say to yourself, one of these days I'm going to stop and read that sign?
I do that all the time.
I do too.
You do?
I do.
Wow, I did not know that. Well, you're going to learn something new on this show every week, and hopefully that wasn't it. I'm Cindy Perman.
And I'm Ken Magos, and this is Drive-By History. Today's travels take us to Fort Lee, New Jersey. On the eastern edge of Bergen County, you've passed through this community as you've headed across the George Washington Bridge. In fact, the bridge has made Fort Lee one of the more recognized communities in our state. However, decades before the bridge, Fort Lee was already in the spotlight.
Hey Ken, check out the sign.
Let's go see.
It says film history was made here, Solax Studios, Lemoyne Avenue in Fort Lee, New Jersey. It was built in 1912 by Alex Guy Blanchet, a filmmaker. And look at this, it was a glass enclosed structure, which I imagine let in a ton of light for those films. And it says that the gatehouse, which is this building right behind us, that was part of the original structure. This is so cool.
Yeah, we need to find out more.
Let's go check with Anthony.
Let's do it. Thomas Edison invented motion pictures, but his movie studio was in Essex County, New Jersey. So how did Fort Lee land a leading role in early motion pictures? To find out more, we head to the Newark Public Library, where drive-by historian Anthony Bernard gets us up to speed on the plot. I grew up on the West Coast, and we obviously learned that filmmaking started in Hollywood. Then Cindy and I come across a sign in Fort Lee that says there were studios there. What's the story here?
Well, it's really interesting. If you know about the history of film, film started around the 1890s, and it was nothing like the films that we know today. The first films were about 1 minute long. And they were usually street scenes or landscape scenes. People weren't used to seeing people move, so it was a really amazing thing just to see, wow, this, people moving in the different parts of this picture. That's why they were called moving pictures. And another thing was that films weren't like films today in terms of you didn't go to the movie theater, get a ticket and sit there and watch the film. You usually saw these super short exhibitions on the sides of storefronts or just in impromptu sort of movie theaters that were there and then gone.
So it wasn't a night out at the theater. It would have been I was going downtown to one of the shops or something like that, and I might have just stopped off for a movie.
Exactly. It was sort of like a technological demonstration, and it was really wowing people because people had never seen moving pictures before, and it was amazing.
Yeah, we take that for granted. But could you imagine if we had never seen that before, and you're walking down a main street and
it had only been a few decades before that people could actually see a photograph of themselves.
Exactly.
So now they were seeing it moving.
Exactly. So now you understand what early movies were about. But eventually, even that stuff started to get a bit stale.
That's how we are about human nature, right?
Of course, we always something new,
What's the next big thing?
So what do you think the next attraction was?
stars,
I'm
guess.
going to guess, honestly, because we're so close to New York, the theater community. I would think they would
Exactly,
start...
vaudeville stars.
That makes sense.
All the people that were famous vaudevillian stars and actors were in the early films, and that was a really amazing thing. It was a big draw, and that's when people, producers, directors started to realize, there is a lot of power and opportunity in bringing stars to the screen. Why don't we start lengthening that, making these films longer and banking the films around the stars? Enter Fort Lee, where movies began and your next adventure begins.
I can't wait to check it out.
The plot thickens. Like Douglas Fairbanks and Mabel Normand, Cindy and I are always ready for an adventure. But rather than a train trestle where a villain lies in wait, our exploits lead to the Fort Lee Film Commission. Executive Director Tom Myers greets us.
Tom, when I think of the movie industry, I think of Hollywood in California. Tell me, what are we doing in Fort Lee, New Jersey?
Well, we, at this museum and with the Film Commission, we like to educate people. The industry started in New Jersey, a few miles from Fort Lee in West Orange, New Jersey. Thomas Edison created the American film industry and in 1893 built the first movie studio called the Black Maria.
But West Orange wouldn't remain the movie capital for long. Production quickly popped across the Hudson.
Well, by the early 1900s, a lot of the industry moved to East 14th Street in Manhattan, and they used brownstones to shoot in. So that was the migration across the river into New York City.
However, as directors started shooting on location, 14th Street would prove limiting. That's when Fort Lee landed in the limelight.
They had space that Manhattan didn't have.
They had space, and in a small town, you had topography. One day, you could, for 1/2 hour, I mean, you could just go to the cliffs of the Palisades and you could shoot action adventure. Then you can go to Main Street and you can do, Main Street USA. It could be any main street in America, and the north section of town was for westerns.
The movie moguls liked the convenience, not to mention the cost savings. In turn, they opened over a dozen studios, including Fox, and what would later become Universal.
And there were hundreds of people going to this studio being employed. So it wasn't just this small little archaic glass thing and, a handful of people. This is a major industry.
Jobs were plentiful. As long as you could make a successful film, the industry embraced everyone and anyone.
You had a lot of women filmmakers, you had African American filmmakers, you had a lot of filmmakers in Fort Lee.
You had this diverse population of filmmakers. When was this?
In the 1910s.
Among the most accomplished, Alice Guy Blanchet.
She came here in 1912, built a state-of-the-art studio with a backlot, film laboratory, studio factory. Employed lots of people. She wrote, produced, and directed hundreds of films here through World War I. She was making synchronized sound films and color films.
It's also fascinating to think about the diversity that was happening in this area at the turn of the 20th century. You've got a film studio in 1910 that's being run by a woman. This is 10 years before women even had the right to vote. You've got other studios that are being run by African American entrepreneurs and putting those actors who are also of color into their films. That's an amazing thing to think about 50 years before the civil rights movement even took hold. In the early 20th century, Fort Lee rivaled Hollywood as the movie capital of the world. There were no trams, but had there been, a tour of any Fort Lee studio would have offered visitors a glimpse of the biggest stars, such as fan favorite Theodosia Goodman.
And she was a nice Jewish girl from Cincinnati, Ohio, who became the first sex symbol of American cinema, Theda Bara.
Starting right here in New Jersey, the
Starting
first sex
right
symbol in
here,
America.
yes.
Va-va-voom pays well. At the height of her fame, Bara earned $4,000 a week. And, according to director Raoul Walsh, she never took herself too seriously.
In his autobiography, he said the one star he liked the most was Theda Bara because he called her a game girl because most were very diva-like. But one day on the back lot, she fell into a pond and her hair was very thick and matted and he thought she was going to start screaming. And she just laughed and said, well, dry me off and let's do it again.
Other stars that became familiar faces in Fort Lee include the handsome and charismatic John Barrymore, First Lady of the Silent Screen, Lillian Gish, and the legendary comic Fatty Arbuckle. However, out of all the stars that worked in Fort Lee and the blockbuster films that made them famous, looking at this clip, one clearly rose to new heights.
Well, that was the most famous movie serial of all time, starring Pearl White, and it's over 100 years old now, and it was shot on location in Fort Lee on the cliffs of the Palisades.
Although little of the silent film era is left in Fort Lee, there is one spot that remains unaltered. The set of the silent classic, The Perils of Pauline. It's a living snapshot into show business history and rivals even the most dramatic locations seen on film today.
I don't want to tell you too much more, but if you follow me, I might be able to show you a little bit of film history.
Wow, Tom, you weren't kidding. This site is absolutely amazing. So we're at Cliffhanger Point on the Palisades. I'm assuming this must look like what it looked like 100 years ago when they were filming movies here.
It looked exactly that way, but this is where movie magic happened in 1914. This was the site of the world's most famous cliffhanger serial, The Perils of Pauline.
Starring Pearl White, the 1914 film often found its lead character in dangerous situations.
And she would shimmy down the cliffs on a rope. The bad guys would try to cut the rope, throw rocks at her.
And unlike movies filmed today, the star was in real danger too.
And she was doing her own stunts, right?
Right, she did it herself.
Because Pearl White was such a big star, the studio took some precautions, modest by today's standards, and they were afforded to only a select few.
The most concern studios had in those days was their cameras. So you would see production stills with the cameraman not tethered, but the camera was tethered.
But not the cameraman, but the camera.
Yes, they cared about it.
Apologies to cameramen
I guess they
everywhere.
can get another cameraman, but to lose a camera was money. The moguls didn't want to lose that much money. So we kid around that Pearl White, and she did all her own stunts, mostly. But we have one shot where we do see a little rope, so she must have been very valuable to the studio because they finally tethered her.
That was the measure. I'm sorry, Ken. I don't see a rope.
You said I didn't need a rope.
You know, we've seen the movie Perils of Pauline, but I didn't realize until I was actually out on that cliff how dangerous it really was. I mean, I like to think I'm pretty tough. I've hiked through this park, I've even scrambled up these Palisades, but when I look over that cliff and think of Pearl White rappelling over the edge, no thank you. I think I learned that I'm not as tough.
The cliff is, however, more than just a reminder of how treacherous movie making once was. Tom Meyer tells us it played a central role in the development of movie terminology. So history was actually made right here.
That's right. This is the birthplace of the cliffhanger. This is where they were born, in essence. This perch atop Fort Palisades.
Cliff.
This actual cliff, this actual stone, right where Pearl White started the first cliffhanger.
Here's what happened. Early films were often serialized, with the story advancing from one week to the next. As films grew more popular, studios quickly learned that they could make more money by leaving their biggest stars in harm's way at the end of a reel. And few stars were ever left in more imminent danger than Pearl White, on these very cliffs. Tom Meyer tells us, The Perils of Pauline was so popular, from that time forward, any film that left the audience hanging has been called a cliffhanger.
I mean, I think, you know, we might all do a few things in the name of fame, but Ken, would you go over the edge there?
No, I would let you do it though.
Tom, how about you?
No, I'm as far, I mean, Pearl, I take my hat off to Pearl. I mean, she did things that I wouldn't dream of doing. I mean, but a great historic spot, not just in Fort Lee, but in all of America in terms of early American cinema.
All good stories come to an end, including this one. Ultimately, the stars and the studios moved west and Hollywood prevailed. However, New Jersey plays a starring role in film history. Movies became a central part of American culture, and although the film business grew up in Hollywood, it was born right here in Fort Lee. The end. There are thousands of history markers yet to discover. Yet Cindy and I stop and smell the roses. What's the history connection? Our next adventure begins now in Madison, New Jersey. Located in Morris County, since the first settlers arrived, this town has gone by many names, including South Hanover and Bottle Hill. But of all the names it's been called, only one would smell so sweet. Hey Cindy, here's our next sign. Okay, Rose City, huh?
Why do they call it that? I haven't seen any
don't
roses
know.
since we've been here.
Well, it says rose culture in this area began in 1856
Largest greenhouse range built in 1880, Madison became known as the Rose City.
Now, I think New Jersey's known for a lot of things, but I've never known it to be for roses.
No.
What's that about?
I don't know. Let's go find out more.
Good
Let's
idea.
talk to Anthony.
I like it.
Given Madison is a community that's about 4 square miles in size and about 25 miles west of New York City, why would rose culture thrive here relative to anywhere else? Something must have happened in Madison that caused the industry to blossom. But what? It's back to the Newark Public Library, where drive-by historian Anthony Bernard is researching New Jersey's aromatic past.
I didn't know until we came across a sign that Madison, New Jersey was once known as the Rose City. What can you tell us about that?
All right, so roses have a really interesting and long history. The rose has been around for 35 million years.
Wait, I'm sorry, 35 million?
35 million years.
Wow.
That's how long they have fossilized remains that are that old. So
it's like a dinosaur bachelor.
yes, exactly.
This rose.
I'll give this rose to the T-Rex. And, yes, exactly. So, but it's been around for a long time. Roses have always been a symbol of beauty and richness and mystery. In fact, roses actually have somewhat of a dark history too. The Romans, some of the Roman emperors made their people, the peasants, cultivate roses instead of food. So they were starving and they had to grow roses for their leaders. So,
What did they do with the roses, though? I mean,
well, roses were just basically a symbol of wealth and power. So they always wanted to have roses and be surrounded with roses. And
So in the way that today we see in wealthy homes or,
You're right. It's
Exactly.
kind of the same thing now.
what do the wealthy have? They have gardens, and they have gardeners, and they have these ornate gardens. It's always, flowers have always been assigned, particularly the rose, as the kind of the king of the flowers. It's just symbolizing beauty and wealth, basically.
But that takes a turn when you have peasants who are starving,
Yes.
Yeah, it certainly
creating
does.
that, growing that for your pleasure.
So it's like anything else. So the rose is kind of like money, you could sort of think of it. And in the 17th century, it actually literally was legal tender. The rose was
Oh, wow.
rose and
We've heard of barter and different things becoming currency. I did not know that.
roses and
Roses.
rose water were used literally as money, as replacements for money. Then we can fast forward to the 19th century when Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's wife, grew an incredible rose garden in a place called Château de Malmaison, where she lived, which was about 7 miles outside of Paris. This extensive rose garden that she was able to cultivate had 250 varieties of roses, which
Wow,
is
that's a lot.
really, really amazing. All these different kinds of roses. It's really an incredible sight. This puts the rose on the map. So you have the illustrator Joseph Redoute, who's a very famous botanical illustrator, drawing all the different roses and stuff and the different varieties. And then the aristocrats in Europe start aping Napoleon's wife, and the rose becomes sort of a symbol of the rich and powerful and aristocratic families of Europe. And then what happens? The American wealthy, rich families who aren't themselves aristocrats because they're not in Europe, but they want to ape what the aristocrats are doing.
Well,
and
sure,
they
I can imagine. The Bonapartes are growing roses. We
Yeah,
must grow roses too.
yeah.
we Rockefellers or we Vanderbilts or
Right.
we Carnegie should be doing the same thing. So this is what starts to happen. So that's why Madison plays such a big part, because Madison was the home of a lot of wealthy,
wealth there.
powerful
makes
people,
sense.
and that's where your adventure begins.
I smell something sweet in our future. Although people from all walks of life run the flower industry today, in the 19th century, the flower business was a profession for people of privilege. The next leg of our investigation takes us to the Madison-based Museum of Early Trades and Crafts. On the steps of the gorgeous building, once the library, we meet with Executive Director Michelle Luciano Foss. So Michelle, it's really exciting that Anthony Bernard was able to send us to you to talk about this. We're here in front of the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts. What can you tell us about this museum?
Well, we're delighted to have you here, Ken, and the museum is really here to enhance everyone's understanding of the lives of everyday people who lived in New Jersey in the 18th and 19th centuries.
So when the rose industry started here in 1856, what did it look like here? What were some of the other trades, and how did the rose industry change the game?
The beginnings of the rose industry really were centered around the major homes that were primarily on the outskirts. beautiful mansions that had a lot of property to be able to sustain the gardens and actually to build the greenhouses that are necessary for the rose industry.
Alfred Treadwell is believed to be the first to build greenhouses on his estate. The quality and fragrance of his roses inspired others to follow in his footsteps. That is, others who could afford the expense.
In fact, it had to start with someone who had a more stable, large cash flow to be able to support this industry. It's not something for just the someone who's living, day to day, or the subsistence farmer. And these very wealthy people, again, developed it as a hobby.
These wealthy rose growers were also shrewd businessmen. And as the years went by, they realized the popularity of Madison roses spelled opportunity.
And in the course of the probably 30 years, 40 years, it transitioned from a hobby to a major commercial enterprise.
Of course, roses were grown around the world, but Madison had a few things going for it. First, the train.
And then the train came to Madison in the 1800s, around 1837 or so. And that really was the connection, the line that linked Madison to Newark and to New York.
The train made shipping such a perishable product possible, and it also brought needed workers to the greenhouses.
Initially, you had the availability of a good, very strong, good labor pool. And in fact, the rose business was a lure for various immigrant groups, Italians predominantly, as well as the Irish, and then various horticulturists who worked in support of it.
The final ingredient, soil that roses love.
And then you had good resources, good land around to be able to do this.
Around the turn of the 20th century, those factors had given rise to a world-class industry. Madison had become one of the nation's prime producers of roses. Demand was so enormous, nearly 50 growers were thriving, with roses under 500,000 square feet of glass.
The thing I think is so amazing is how huge this industry was. At its peak, there were 500,000 square feet of glass in those greenhouses.
By 1950, on the northern edge of town, there were greenhouses as far as the eye could see. So this photo that we're looking at here, are these actual greenhouses in this photo? It looks like an aerial from probably when it was at its peak.
Yes, this is a shot of Madison from the air in really the northern edge of town, the area that is closest to Florham Park. And what you can see here really are just rows and rows of greenhouses, separate buildings and building upon building upon building, surrounded by beautiful countryside that still existed in Madison in the 50s.
For the next leg of our adventure, we turn to Susan Simon, the former president of the Madison Historical Association. She meets us at Summerhill Park, a beautiful oasis in a lovely neighborhood. If you were to simply stroll through this park on a warm afternoon, you'd never know it harbored a secret. I'm looking around seeing the remnants of some kind of foundation.
Of the estate, the Stemler estate, and they had greenhouses.
So this is kind of ground zero for
so
one of them?
this is one of the last of the remnants of the greenhouses.
In 1875, Jenny Stemler built a magnificent home on this site. Like so many of her peers, she too produced roses. The concrete foundations of her greenhouses and now rusted water pipes, which you see here behind the weeds, are vestiges from that celebrated era.
This property alone, they had at least 36,000 square feet of glass in the greenhouses here.
Roses grown in these and other Madison greenhouses were coveted not only by the rich and the renowned, but also by the royal.
And were there any famous people that collected Madison roses?
The Queen of
The Queen of England.
Wow.
She used Noe roses. The son of Noe, Louis Noe, his son, also sent, I believe it was 100 roses to her, and she then continued to have Noe roses.
Do you know what type?
American Beauty roses.
American Beauty roses to the Queen of England.
Appropriate. What happened to the roses of Madison? How did a thriving and world-famous industry vanish relatively quickly? In the second half of the 20th century, commuters looking for a place to raise families started making their homes in Madison. In turn, the land became more valuable to home builders than rose growers, and it was developed. Ultimately, Madison was transformed from a town brimming with greenhouses to a community of elegant residences. I find it amazing that you can walk through a park like this Summerhill Park that we're in right now, and you walk right past the old foundations that they're sitting there in the ivy. You don't even notice that they're there. I quite honestly would have walked right past them without knowing that this was the center of the rose industry here in Madison. There were greenhouses that lined this and an estate that's long gone, but it's fascinating to know that, and you can walk through here and now and see the remnants that Mother Nature is trying to take back. The business of rose growing may have moved elsewhere. The appreciation for roses remains vibrant as ever. In the summer, Madison is dotted with small rose gardens, a tribute to the town's historic past. Madison may no longer be the flower capital it once was, but to the people who live here, it will always be the Rose City. See you next time. Made possible by the generous support of King's Food Markets. King's, where inspiration strikes. Founded in 1936 in Summit, New Jersey, King's has been a familiar and trusted friend to area families for almost 80 years. Through its Act Against Hunger initiative, King's is making an impact on hunger relief throughout the communities it serves, with over 100,000 pounds of food donated each year and countless monetary donations made to those in need. King's is proud to be part of New Jersey's history. Additional funding provided by the Puffin Foundation, continuing the dialogue between art and the lives of ordinary people. On the next Drive-By History, a road sign in Fort Lee leads to a great deal of drama, and some comedy too. Find out how a small town in Bergen County once played a leading role in the picture business. Then, our adventures lead to the Rose City. Which community proudly celebrates its sweet-scented past?